Already strained relations between China and Japan just got worse. Naval drills by Tokyo have caused even more anger in Beijing, and the Japanese Prime Minister is as defiant as ever. So how far will all this go? And how does the United States view a confrontation that pits China against Japan, one of its closest allies? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hazem Sika. Well, rising tensions between Asia's most powerful nations, that's what we're talking about. A year ago, Japan's decision to buy 3 disputed islands in the East China Sea sparked protests and a boycott of Japanese goods across China. That territorial dispute continues, and now the two countries are arguing over a disruption to a military exercise. China's growing power, Japan's imperial legacy, and a surge in nationalist sentiments on both sides all have their part to play in the frayed relations. Rob McBride has more now from Hong Kong.
China and Japan have been here before, but both sides are talking tougher than ever. The dispute over territory is deepening. Both sides send warplanes into disputed airspace, and patrol boats push contested boundaries at sea. Japan's Conservative Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has warned his troops, rid yourselves of the notion that just the existence of a defense force could act as a deterrent. While China has warned that any firing on its unmanned drone aircraft would constitute a serious provocation, an act of war of sorts. The question is how far they will back up their rhetoric.
Both sides are indeed very calculative. They would like to catch attention. They would like to be known from the public that they are doing the best for the country.
Previous encounters around the islands, known as the Diaoyu in China and Senkaku in Japan, have inflamed passions on both sides, playing well to domestic agendas. For an increasingly assertive China and for the resurgent nationalism of Japan's Shinzo Abe, the significance of this dispute is obvious. Military conflict remains unlikely, so both sides are willing to escalate the war of words, knowing they can do so with impunity. As in the past, observers believe economic realities are likely to be a sobering influence.
The business community from both sides would like to pressure the governments to be more rational, and then it's quite likely that the government would listen to them.
But Xi Jinping is facing equal pressure from more hawkish members of the Chinese government.
At the same time, there are people within the Chinese leadership who are, which I would call hardliners or more adventurous leaders, in particular in the military, who are ready to take more risks than in the past.
And coming up against an unyielding Abe, everyone knows the danger of an accidental military confrontation. That would take this dispute into areas nobody wants to go and whose outcome nobody can foresee. Rob McBride, Al Jazeera, Hong Kong.
So let's bring in our guests now to talk more about this. In Hong Kong, we have Andrew Leung, an independent China analyst. Joining us from New York, Gordon Chang, East Asian political analyst and author of The Coming Collapse of China. And joining us via Skype from Tokyo is Tina Burrett, Professor of Political Science at Temple University, Japan campus. Good to have you all with us. Tina Burrett, let me start with you. How do you assess then the state of relations at the moment between Japan and China?
Well, obviously, they're at one of the lowest points that they have been in the past couple of years. And that's really saying something, because in the past 6 months to 9 months, the relationship has been pretty poor. So I think we are in quite a dire situation right now.
So how does this compare then with previously? I mean, obviously, there's a long history there between these two countries. Is there a danger that this could escalate further?
Well, I think at the moment we're still in the phase of it being a war of words. But because there's so much activity in the area around the disputed territories in terms of military exercises, but also constant patrols by both sides, the chances of there being some kind of mishap or misunderstanding that leads to an escalation is really quite a real possibility, I think.
Andrew Leung, we heard our correspondent Rob McBride earlier saying at the beginning of his report that China and Japan have been here before, but both sides are talking tougher than ever. I mean, these are two proud nations with a long history of tension and conflict that goes back centuries. Why now? Why are things so tense right now? And what got us to this point?
Yes, you're quite right. I mean, these territorial disputes have been on the cards for decades. And why now? I think the reason is because of, as your editor was mentioning, I mean, there's a rising nationalism on both sides, and also rising national strength in the case of China, and then an attempt to recover its national strength in the case of Japan. But what is more, I think, is because of Americans' pivot to Asia. Now, this pivot to Asia, of course, is a relatively recent thing. America is now trying to reposition its worldwide military assets towards Asia. And then also this policy takes the form of closer military ties with China's neighbors, and also strengthening various bases in the case of Japan. And of course, the South China Sea to China is more than territorial dispute. It is a very important conduit for natural resources, oil and other minerals from all over the world. In fact, this is China's lifeblood. So combined with territorial integrity, energy security, and the sense of national pride, plus Japan's attitude towards its past war crimes. Japan has never really attuned for its war crime. More than that, I mean, for example, Japan has never admitted the crimes over the comfort women issue, for example, and it's also continuing paying homage to the Yakasuni shrines, housing various Class A war criminals. Now, just imagine if Germany continues to pay homage to a shrine honoring Hitler. You know, what would its neighbors think? So the combination of all these factors translate into a very tense situation, and a typical kind of security dilemma is happening on both sides. As my fellow panelists were saying, the danger of a miscalculation and misfire and mismaneuver is very, very great. And then, of course, the United States has got a treaty with Japan, and the United States doesn't want to be dragged into the fray. But on the other hand, if push comes to shove and there's a real conflict, there's a real danger that America unwillingly will be dragged into the game. So that, I think that is a very delicate situation.
Indeed, and we'll talk more about the United States certainly does have a big role to play here, and we'll talk more about that in just a moment. But I want to turn now to Gordon Chang, and I want to ask you as well, how much does domestic consumption play in all of this? I mean, we heard Andrew Leung there listing all of the various areas of tension between Japan and China at the moment, but how much is this about posturing, both sides wanting to appear tough in front of their public back home?
I think this is mostly a China story because we need to put this into context. You know, China is trying to take territory away from an arc of nations, from India in the south to South Korea in the north. And that, of course, is triggering nationalistic reactions among some of the populations involved. The other thing that's important to put this into context is that Mao Zedong, who was a very strong leader, basically had very good relationships with Japan. But what we have seen in China, especially from Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao and now Xi Jinping, where you're dealing with weaker leaders, and they have been falling back on nationalism to bolster the legitimacy of the Communist Party. It's important to note that these islands have been controlled by Japan for decades and decades, but China is upsetting the status quo by sending its vessels into Japanese-controlled waters and its planes into Japanese-controlled airspace. This is very hostile and aggressive, and that's why you're triggering the reaction in Japan. I'm not going to defend nationalists in Japan, but on the other hand, you have to understand what's going on, and it's important to distinguish between cause and effect.
But, I mean, you talk about the fact that the nationalism in Japan is purely driven by what China has been doing. Is that entirely true? I mean, doesn't some of the responsibility on this lie on the Japanese leadership? And would a different prime minister have handled this differently?
Well, there's, the friction between Japan and many of its neighbors is caused by Japanese basically not apologizing enough, maybe. I mean, the Japanese have apologized, and they've certainly been a peaceful nation. So, in certain cases where you have friction between Japan and South Korea, I think Japan is largely responsible for that. But we're talking about China. And with regard to China, I think this is primarily a Chinese problem, not a Japanese one. The Chinese make all sorts of excuses, such as Yakasuni, shrine visits, and the rest. But that's not about that. There's a problem here, and it really is an origin in Beijing.
Andrew Leung, what's your take on that this is entirely a Chinese problem?
Well, I think that this, as I was saying, that this is a security dilemma problem, and the problem lies on both sides. I mean, if one side takes up a more confrontational stance, and the other side doesn't agree with the counter-territorial claims, and both sides would take up positions. I think as far as China is concerned, of course, rising nationalism is a fact, it's a reality, both in China and Japan. And for example, the right-wing politics under Abe is trying to build up its formal national defense force. And there are even indications that they want to revise the Japanese constitution. Now, that's all well and good, because after all these years, Japan wants to be a, within quotation marks, normal nation. But on the other hand, the national psyche on the part of Japan, and of course the same with Korea, is still very, very deep, coming back to all these years of aggression from Japan. But as I was saying, to China is more than national sovereignty, is more than the kind of confrontation, is also national security. As China sees the South China Sea, which is a conduit for China's lifeblood, increasingly being controlled by American force projection, and also rising Japanese militarism in the area. Naturally, China would be worried. And as for the rise of nationalism being used by the Chinese leadership, yes, to a certain extent, but I don't think that with the growth of the economy over the past decades, the Chinese leadership seems to be, on top of the situation in China. But as far as the external situation is concerned, it is in fact had the support of most of the Chinese people.
Well, let's broaden this out then and talk about the role that the United States can play in all of this. The United States has a number of reasons for wanting to calm things down between Japan and China. President Barack Obama has talked about a pivot towards Asia, a policy aimed at reinvigorating U.S. military and economic influence in the region. And despite wariness of growing Chinese influence, the U.S. is increasingly economically dependent on the Asian power. And on the other side, the U.S. has a commitment to defend Japan against external aggression, an agreement that goes back decades. The last thing it wants to see is an escalation between an old ally and a growing rival. So to continue with this then, Tina Burrett, I mean, the U.S. certainly has to sort of tread a fine line here in terms of dealing with both China and Japan. I mean, obviously, it has there is a close alliance with Japan that goes back decades, but also China is a huge trading partner, so it has to take that into consideration as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a very delicate balancing act for the United States. But it's been an interesting sort of scenario since Barack Obama became president. I think within Japan, there is somewhat of a feeling that perhaps the United States is not paying as much attention to Japan, or is not, certainly Japan isn't feeling the same kind of connection with this administration as perhaps it's felt with others. For example, when Prime Minister Abe returned to power in December 2012, President Obama asked him to wait for a month before he came to visit him in the United States. Also at the G20 summit in St. Petersburg in September this year, Prime Minister Abe didn't manage to have a one-to-one meeting with the US president, even though there was time made in the president's schedule to meet with President Xi of China and also Francois Hollande. So I think the Japanese are feeling perhaps that they're being slightly, not snubbed, but left slightly to one side by the United States. And I think perhaps in the terms of Abe, this is actually motivated partly by the United States seeing Abe as being one of the factors creating some of the tensions in this region. It was interesting when John Kerry was in Japan in October. He made a very deliberate visit to a cemetery in Japan where we have the remains of people who are unidentified soldiers who fought in the Second World War. He went along there with Chuck Hagel, and I think this was the US saying, well, look, there's this other cemetery which we think is more like the equivalent of Arlington within Japan that lawmakers can visit if they want to pay their respects to those who died in the Second World War without visiting the Yasukuni Shrine, which is so loaded with all of these political issues and questions about the war criminals whose souls are interred there. So I think we are perhaps seeing Japan feeling somewhat frustrated with its relationship with the United States at the moment.
Gordon Chang, is that how you see things? I mean, what role do you think the US can play here in terms of tempering all of this?
Yeah, I certainly agree with Tina. The United States has not stood with Japan, and that's going to be a problem. You got to put this, as I said, into context. You know, last year the Chinese grabbed Scarborough Shoal from the Philippines, and the United States, despite our defense treaty with Manila, let the Chinese do that because we thought it wasn't important enough. And then what the Chinese did was it now is trying to grab other Philippine territory, and it ramped up pressure on the Senkakus, which the Chinese call the Daoyus. So I think the United States is not understanding the dynamic here and is allowing a situation to deteriorate. And that is causing a problem because we are not standing with our friends as we need to do. This is not just an Asia problem. This is an American problem that we see around the world. And I think it's going to cause a very serious situation in Asia soon.
Yeah, Andrew Leung, I mean, we talked earlier there about the U.S. pivot to Asia. What sort of role can it bring to this Asian dispute?
Well, first of all, I think the relationship between the United States and Japan is a coincidence of wants on both sides. America wants to project its power in Asia, and then is using Japan as its own, of course, is very close ally, but also as a kind of proxy under the kind of outsourced rebalancing strategy. In other words, the rebalancing of the region and asking the allies to bear more responsibility, to take more direct action. So that's on the side of America. As far as Japan is concerned, Japan wants to re-exert its influence in the region, and so both sides is a meeting of wants. Now, and I was saying that causes a security dilemma between the United States, Japan, and China. And so how to balance the situation? I think the most important thing is that be it relationship with China or with South Korea, I think Japan has got to face its past squarely. For example, separating the Class A war criminals from the Yasukuni Shrine so that they can continue to pay homage to the shrine without treading on sensitive tissues. And then secondly, try to manage the situation, agreeing to a kind of code of conduct so that there is no misfire on both sides, and then establishing hotlines between the highest levels of the military so that things don't get escalated. Don't forget, if there is a worsening situation, the things can get out of hand very quickly, and like or not, America will be dragged into the game, which would be disastrous because the whole thing can escalate without any chance of being rolled back. You know, once fire is military fire is open on both sides, a plane is shot down, even if it's a drone, and it can cause tremendous consequences.
Tina Burrett, if we talk a little bit more about Shinzo Abe, the Japanese Prime Minister, and how he has handled all of this. Is this entirely a response to the way China has behaved, or is there was there a conscious decision on the part of his party to pursue a more aggressive foreign policy in the region?
Well, I mean, the tensions with China really began, I think, when Japan purchased some of the Senkaku Islands from their private Japanese owner in September 2012. So some of these tensions do predate Abe's return to the premiership. And I should point out that when the government of Japan, the national government, bought those islands, they were really responding to a situation that had been created by the nationalist mayor of Tokyo, who was talking about purchasing the islands and putting them under the jurisdiction of Tokyo. So really the Japanese government at that point was moving to try and lessen some of the impact of the damage that was caused by the governor of Tokyo. Obviously, it wasn't read that way in Beijing, perhaps deliberately. So Shinzo Abe was returned to the presidency amidst all this tension that already existed between China and Japan. And part of his re-election campaign was predicated on his reputation as being a foreign policy hawk, somebody who's always, as part of his agenda, wanted to strengthen Japan's national defenses, to change the constitution to allow Japan to have collective security, also to strengthen spending on the military in Japan. So this is something that was known about Prime Minister Abe before he was elected, and this has been his stance long before the tension started to escalate. Certainly this was his position when he was Prime Minister before. I think what's different now is there's more of a receptive audience in Japan for strengthening Japan's security position. Although if we look at opinion polls in Japan, the majority of people are still against a lot of Japanese people are extremely proud of their pacifist constitution, and also as realists, they recognize that changing the constitution in this climate would damage relations with China and also with South Korea. So it's quite a nuanced situation within the country.
Gordon Chang, how much do economic realities play a role in all of this? I mean, obviously there's a great deal of trade between Japan and China. We're talking about the second biggest economy in the world in China. It is a huge market for Japan. So there certainly is a need there for this conflict to be reined in at some point, where the economic realities and the sort of mutual dependence that they have there will ultimately be a check on this escalating any further, don't you think?
Actually, I don't think that's the true. You know, of course, Japan and China have very strong economic relations, but they're deteriorating. And they're deteriorating in part because of the geopolitical friction. So you see Japanese companies now shunning investment in China and moving plants to Southeast Asia, as we started to see 2 years ago. And one of the things that is clear, and we've seen this in patterns with other countries, that when economic relations start to lessen, then you can have these geopolitical tensions flare. And that's exactly what you could see right now between China and Japan. As trade becomes more strained, geopolitics takes over. And so I'm not so sure that the trade relationship, which once did influence relations in both China and Japan, is now as much a factor as it once was, say, 20, 30 years ago.
Andrew Leung, how would you gauge the economic factors here?
Well, I think it's a chicken and egg situation. I think there is a reality that China is Japan's biggest trading partner. It still is at the moment. Of course, as Gordon was saying, that the relationship is deteriorating and the trade volume is declining. But then, of course, that applies to some of the China's neighbors as well. But then there's also a reality that most of China's neighbors in the region have China as the biggest trading partner. So they rely on China for investment, for jobs, for trade. But then on the other hand, they fall back on America, taking advantage of the military umbrella as a leverage against too much of a China influence. So this is a very nuanced and situation. But on the other hand, if you look at what's happening at the APEC meeting just now, the Chinese leaders took advantage of that meeting and the absence of Obama there to reaffirm China's peaceful intentions of focusing on the positive, focusing on cooperation, setting aside territorial disputes with some of the neighbors, saying that referring to the possibility of joint exploration, for example. And it adopts more or less the same kind of stance towards Japan, except that, of course, in the case of Japan, things more complicated with Japan's past and then Yagashini Shrine, but also with the rising Japanese militarism and nationalism. So I think that the situation needs to continue to be monitored. But I think it's always important to concentrate on the positive, concentrate and build trust building. I think is the answer.
All right, and on that, we've got to leave it. It'll be fascinating to see how all of this does play out. But I want to thank all three of our guests, Andrew Leung, Gordon Chang, and Tina Burrett. Thanks very much. And thank you for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Remember, if you want to send us your feedback, just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. And if you're on Twitter, you can reach me on @Hazem Sika. That's it. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.